Tim Shorrock is the author of Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing. He was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement and is an expert on U.S. military policies in Asia and the Korean Peninsula. He writes for The Nation and Alternate, among others, and you can follow him on Twitter at Timothy S. So thanks for agreeing to talk today.
Thank you.
So do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Koreas right now? We have U.S. president threatening to destroy North Korea in front of the UN. At least in the post-Cold War era, is this kind of unprecedented territory for the U.S.-North Korean relations?
Not really. It's although it's heightened now more than it's ever been before. But we've been through a lot of tension with North Korea for the last 60 years, so it's actually not much new. What's new, of course, is that they've developed advanced weaponry, including nuclear weapons, and also have very advanced missile technology and an ability to fire an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is really different from the past. But there's been lots of conflict and tension between the U.S. and North Korea for years.
So you do write an article, or you wrote in a recent article in The Nation, that a review of recent events and U.S. government statements shows that, in fact, the military option against North Korea has eclipsed negotiations as the strategy of choice and become almost conventional thinking in Washington. Is there a real military option for the U.S. that doesn't involve tremendous numbers of deaths? And then we're talking, not a small, we're talking possibly millions of deaths. Is that something real the U.S. has options here?
Well, I don't think so, but apparently there's a lot of people in Washington that think it's a viable option. And even recently, Secretary of Defense Mattis said that my option included strategies where South Korea would not be affected terribly much by U.S. military action, which I think is ludicrous. But at any rate, there seems to be a lot of talk about U.S. military capabilities and what it could actually do. In fact, the whole focus of discussion by both government and in the media and all the experts that you see on TV is basically about North Korean and U.S. capabilities, the fact that North Korea is getting close to having a ICBM that it can load a nuclear weapon on it, and how far those missiles can go, and then what the U.S. can do to counter that, what a U.S. attack would look like, what a U.S. preemptive strike on North Korea would look like. There's total fascination and focus on that, as opposed to like the politics of the situation and what does North Korea want, and how could the United States, reach a settlement with them that would be fair to both sides and fair to the Korean people and the American people. There's no focus on that almost whatsoever, but it seems to be, the fact is that the Trump administration and past U.S. administrations have said they North Korea getting nuclear weapons, having the ability to have nuclear weapons is out of the question, and they have to stop the program. But there's no attempt really to try to lay some groundwork for negotiating anything around that. And I think that's partly why I wrote that, was that it seems that the military option is the one that's most popular and most talked about. And, Mattis and Tillerson, the Secretary of State, keep saying, no, the focus is on diplomacy. But there's still all this talk, and, everyone knows what you led off with, that Trump said if the North Korean threats continue, he will totally destroy North Korea. And they've also used the word annihilation. They're talking about mass murder of 25 million people. And I think that it's very sad that we're at this point.
So you've got, this is all happening about, 4,000 miles away from us. But what is the view of this in South Korea? The South Koreans have just elected, as I understand, a moderate president, but they're also known kind of the long history of fanatic anti-communists. So seeing as how moderate U.S. presidents can have a hard time getting the reins of policy, especially foreign policy. Does the new President Moon, does he seem in control of South Korea, and does he have any hopes of swaying a U.S. policy on this matter?
Well, the fanatic anti-communists are out of power in South Korea and have been for some time. And President Moon's election was, in part, the result of what they call the Candlelight Revolution, which was a basically democratic revolution against the past government, and the past government of Park Geun-hye in particular, who was she was impeached and forced out of office, and is now in jail awaiting criminal charges. People stood in city squares throughout South Korea for months and months on end to call for her ousting, and wanted a more democratic state, more democratic country, wanted to decrease tensions with North Korea, wanted more economic security, wanted a better life. And Moon Jae-in came out of the democratic tradition in South Korea. He had been an activist. He'd been a human rights lawyer, labor lawyer in the 70s and 80s. He was the former chief of staff to the last progressive president, Roh Moo-hyun. So he has a strong record of being involved in the people's movement there, democratic movement. And he came to office partly campaigning to return to the days of the sunshine policies of Kim Dae-jung, which was where there was openness toward North Korea, and there was lots of détente in a way, that there was people's exchanges, there was cultural exchanges, there was economic cooperation as a way to break down the tension, and he wanted to go back to that and have direct talks. North Korea has not taken them up on that. They see South Korea and the Moon government is far too dependent on the United States and its military. But I think he does reflect the will of the South Korean people, which is they want to have South-North negotiations, and they want to have an alleviation of the tensions. And when I was there in the spring, and in April and May in South Korea, and also, following Koreans in events there in recent weeks, most South Koreans are a lot more concerned about what President Trump might do than what Kim Jong-un and North Korea might do. And that it really worries them that Trump might do a unilateral, some preemptive strike and cause a war. And so, there's a lot of hope there that this could be resolved through a diplomatic way.
So you've also kind of have Japan. You wrote another article about Abe sort of being Trump's go-to guy on this. Are they playing a hardline role, or do they see a lot of risks because being so close to the situation?
Both. I mean, Shinzo Abe comes out of this very right-wing reactionary tradition of Japanese politics. He's the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is neither liberal or democratic, as my father used to say growing up in Japan. And it's a very right-wing party. And for years, LDP has been elements of the LDP. His power base, in particular, has been pushing for Japan to basically rearm and cast out its old, constitution, which prohibits it from sending troops into battle ever. And they want to change that. They want Japan to become a more, what they call normal nation and normal military power. And they're part of this alliance with the U.S. and they've been, building that, strengthening that alliance for many years. And so I think the North Korea crisis is a way for him to, push on those kind of policies, to urge Japan to support his policies and urge them to support the rearmament and remilitarization of Japan. And so he's been a strong influence. He's very, him and Trump struck up a relationship, and they're on very friendly terms. They share the sort of same kind of fascist leanings, I think. Whereas I think Trump and Moon have had a much more, shaky relationship. Moon comes from a progressive tradition that Trump has no concept of and no idea of. And, there's been some disagreements about, well, for one thing, Moon has to keep saying over and over again that war on the Korean Peninsula is unthinkable. But this seems to be very, not a problem for Trump to talk about a war there.
As a practical matter, do the South Koreans have any control over what the United States does with its military in their country?
Yes, they do. I mean, they they're a sovereign nation, but there's some, one issue in Korea is that, obviously there's a massive U.S. military presence there. There's, some, 28,000 U.S. troops there for one thing. But also, this is not known by many people outside of Korea, but a U.S. general is in command of the Korean military in times of war. They have a joint U.S. ROK, Republic of Korea, military command, and right now that's headed by a Korean general. But during times of war, leadership would pass to the U.S. general, who would be in charge. And so the U.S. has enormous military influence there. And the U.S. has been there for decades and has all kinds of relationships from top to bottom in the military and intelligence services. So it could really put a lot of pressure on South Korea, as it does and as it has over the years. But South Korea has had to be insistent. Moon has had to be insistent by saying, like for example, when he heard that there was reports that the U.S. was considering a unilateral military strike on North Korean missile facilities, but by B-1 bombers that would be outside of Korean airspace and would not need South Korean approval to fire their missiles. President Moon, objected to that and said any military action must have South Korean, support. And, so they've been able to, impress upon the Trump administration the importance of that. And, McMaster, H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor, has gone there and met with them around those issues to reinforce, the fact that they would be consulted. But, it's a difficult relationship, and I think the U.S. does have more power in South Korea than it has in almost any other country in the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so kind of to change gears a little bit and talk about some little earlier history, you just wrote a very interesting article for Alternet called How Sony, Obama, Seth Rogen, and the CIA Secretly Planned to Force Regime Change in North Korea, and the subtitle was A Secret Backstory of the U.S.-North Korea Standoff. It's a really interesting look at this kind of confluence of the press and Hollywood and media and our foreign policy in the U.S. So maybe before we get into the more covert part of it, can you just remind us a bit about the film, The Interview, and how the story of the hack played out in the U.S. media?
Well, The Interview was this kind of silly movie, kind of ridiculous movie about by Seth Rogen about these two Hollywood guys, and one's a producer, one's an interviewer, and they're going to go to interview Kim Jong-un, and they're hired by the CIA to assassinate Kim Jong-un, and they go along with it, and they in fact assassinate him, and they kill him. And at the end of the film, it shows Kim Jong-un's head being blown apart in slow motion. And so they were making the film, and they began when within the Sony Corporation, when there was some grumbling and some disapproval of the way that Kim Jong-un and other Koreans were portrayed, and some concern about that scene when his head was blown off, and another scene where his face melted off. There was some concern within the studios about this, that it could offend Asians and it could offend North Korea in a way that wouldn't be good, and so they started consulting and working with the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is a very powerful military think tank in Washington, and it's based in Santa Monica, but has offices here. And it turns out, so happened that the CEO of Sony was on the board of directors of RAND, and so he got one of RAND's analysts, who's a big, he's a proponent of regime change in North Korea. He's a proponent of getting rid of Kim Jong-un as a way to, kickstart a revolution as he sees it in North Korea. And they hired him to give advice to the film. And in fact, he saw it, and they showed the ending to the State Department, senior officials at the State Department. This is, of course, during the Obama administration. And the State Department and this RAND consultant said, keep that scene in, or his head blows up. And they did. And so, it was basically, as I described it in the article, it's basically a psyop, a psychological operation to try to, obviously, ridicule Kim Jong-un and damage his reputation among North Koreans, with the hope that people would see it and somehow, it would trigger some kind of opposition to him. So that was the gist of the story. And interestingly, and then so after, while the movie was coming out, there was all this discussion about it in the press, there was a hack of Sony. Listeners may remember that, Sony was hacked by supposedly the U.S. government, so it was North Korea, and they leaked the hackers got all this email, internal Sony email from other stars and directors and all kinds of people, and they leaked all the email, and it was very embarrassing to Sony. And and then supposedly this was done by North Korea. There's a lot of evidence, as I say in the story, that actually the hack was not done by North Korea, but nevertheless, that was the conclusion of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration also, as I mentioned in that article, was involved on its own, cyber war against North Korea for many years, and actually had penetrated the North Korean internal internet and computer systems. The NSA had done that and was able to monitor a lot of internal, internet traffic within North Korea, and which raises the question whether if this hack happened, whether they had been sort of watched it happen, allowed it to happen. It's unclear, but I think there's still a lot more to be investigated about that part of it. But anyway, this episode, and Obama used it to impose further sanctions on North Korea, and give the impression that North Korea was really out of control, and that this was about 2014. But there's a lot, there's a deeper story to it.
And Obama called their supposed hack, he called it an act of war, right?
He did, and it was the first time sanctions were ever imposed on another country for attacking not the government but a corporation. It was, so it was like sanctions were imposed for undermining a corporation. It wasn't even a U.S. corporation; it was a Japanese corporation. So there's a lot of sort of odd things about it, but basically, this idea that the U.S. can help force regime change in North Korea, through psychological operations and information ops is it's pretty much kind of like the war talk now, pretty much part of the discussion. And in fact, yesterday, I heard David Sang of the New York Times reporter who's chronicled this whole cyber war with North Korea, talk about the North Korean hack again as a major sort of incident that happened in U.S.-North Korean relations, and so it's still very present in people's minds. And today in the Wall Street Journal, I was reading a story about a reporter had talked to various military analysts in Washington what to do about North Korea, and they were talking about the same thing. They were talking about damaging Kim Jong-un's reputation and supporting elites here that might move against Kim Jong-un. So I think it's just part of a policy that the United States has been following, a regime change policy that's not quite described as that, but that's what it is. that's been going on for some years. And, North Korea is quite aware of it, obviously, and, wants to maintain its sovereignty and does not want its government to be overthrown, and so they're going to defend themselves against it.
Well, it's so fascinating. I mean, this might be a little bit of a chicken and egg question, but do we know where even you have a Japanese corporation? I don't know if that plays any role, but then you've got Hollywood and the U.S. government. Is like, did this movie start out as some goofy idea in Hollywood, or do we know if the government itself was kind of trying to bring this thing to fruition, or is this just all lost in the haze?
No, it was a kooky idea that started in Hollywood. Specifically, it started, the way I read about it and described it in the article was that, after the U.S. assassinated Osama bin Laden, SEALs Team 6 went in there, there had already been a script floating around about Kim Jong-un, and so after the assassination of Osama bin Laden, Seth Rogen and his buddies, thought that, let's make a movie about the assassination of Kim Jong-un. And so they started the movie, and they were making the movie, and as I said, it was sort of like the politics of the end and what happens and how you depict his assassination and what that could mean to, as in terms of what the public impact of that might be in North and South Korea. That was sort of outsourced to the government, and that's where the government came in. Mm-hmm. According to Seth Rogen, he had an advisor that he was pretty sure was with the CIA. So, I think it was pretty broad, interest by the government in the outcome of this movie. And I think it was because it played into this, what the government has been doing by, trying in various ways to undercut the Kim Jong-un government and the government of his father and grandfather.
Well, there's a lot of there's a lot of history to this. It's all very interesting. I guess just one more question and then a little concluding bit. So, what do you have obviously we all hope that there's no sort of military action here, but what are your practical outlook for the next, year or so on this?
I think, tensions are going to continue unless, first of all, at the beginning of the year, Kim Jong-un declared that by the end of the year, he wanted to have a capability of a nuclear weapon on an ICBM. And they've been, publicly driving toward this for a few years now. And they certainly don't hide what they do. Everything is done in broad daylight, out in the open, so U.S. satellites and surveillance planes can photograph it. And so they haven't hidden that objective. And the United States says, that's like they don't want them to have any kind of nuclear capability like that. And the objective is denuclearization. And so, North Korea has offered to talk about a peace treaty. They don't seem to want to negotiate away their nuclear capability. They would like to be recognized as a nuclear power and have a peace treaty, and they don't want to use their nuclear weapons. Theoretically, like the U.S. doesn't want to use its nuclear weapons either. But if the United States, even after these sanctions and all the pressure they put on China, if North Korea, continues in this way, that's when, that's what Trump has said. That's where the military option could come in. I think that within the military, there's enough knowledge of what the outcome would be if any kind of military action, which would be a catastrophe for the region, as you said, the top of the show, millions of Koreans could die, tens of thousands, if not millions of Americans could die, many Japanese could die. This would be, even without nuclear weapons, North Korea still does not have the capability to put a nuke on top of a missile. But even without that, with conventional weapons, this could be a terrible, terrible war. And North Korea has all kinds of artillery on the border that could just rain death on Seoul within minutes. And so it's a hair trigger kind of situation. And I guess I'm encouraged by the fact that General Mattis, Secretary of Defense, and Tillerson keeps saying that they want a diplomatic solution and let kind of Trump just spout off like he does, but they always come back and say diplomatic solution. They did this again yesterday. And so I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail. I think that there has to be an exit ramp given North Korea. Like, okay, well, yesterday McMaster said that the U.S. would not negotiate, until North Korea could verify that it had done away with its nuclear weapons program. And, you can't insist on surrender before you negotiate. There has to be something you can negotiate around. And so, like, the most sensible, proposals that have been made and that have been pressed by both China and Russia and at the UN have been, this freeze for freeze, where North Korea freezes its programs, its missile tests, and freezes its nuclear tests in return for a freeze or slowdown or reduction of these vast U.S. South Korean military exercises that take place twice a year. That are huge. That are the largest military exercises in the world, in which they practice and train for what they call decapitation of the North Korean leadership, which is like killing off the entire North Korean leadership. They also practice nuclear war. So, if there could be some way, we reduce tensions by cutting back on those exercises, they stop their tests, and then at least talk about, what the U.S. and North Korea can talk about. Maybe it'll take, a diplomat, a leader from another country, say, Angela Merkel of Germany, to step in and offer to try to negotiate, something to kickstart some talks that would lead to U.S. talking to North Korea. That's just the only way this can be resolved. And, in the past, there's been many, many talks between North Korea and the United States, and some of them have led to some very positive developments. And, one agreement with Clinton in the 90s, they actually stopped their nuclear program. This is before they had a weapon, of course. But they stopped their production of plutonium and fissile material for 12 years. And, the U.S. and North Korea agreed to end their hostile policies and to normalize policies. And I think that there's a possibility of going back to that, but, they've seen what the results are when other countries like Iraq or Libya disarmed. In the case of Libya, they gave up their nuclear weapons, and a few years later, the U.S. and NATO helped overthrow, in a bombing campaign, overthrew the Libyan government. And that was sort of like the last straw for the Kim regime in North Korea. They saw that and said, we've got to have these nuclear weapons to protect ourselves. So, the North Koreans say they will negotiate if and when the U.S. drops its hostile policy. So somehow the United States is going to have to consider ways of how it can drop its hostile policy if it doesn't want to have a war. And how that comes about, I'm not sure, but I hope and as someone who's lived in Korea and knows many Koreans, a war would be just a terrible, terrible thing. I lived in South Korea as a kid in the aftermath of the Korean War. Another, 3 to 4 million people were killed in that war. And North Korea was completely destroyed by U.S. bombing. And it was left in cinders. And so, that's no choice at all. That's not an option.
Right.
And so let's hope that, cooler heads can prevail and somehow people in the U.S. government can, find a way to talk directly to the Kim Jong-un government.
Yeah, I think that's what everybody's got to hope for. It's too bad that we're in such a strange time with our current president. But just before we go, I'm actually real interested. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your book on intelligence outsourcing? That sounds interesting.
Well, it's been 10 years since I finished it.
I'm sorry.
2008.
Okay.
But but it's still very topical. I mean, there's no other book like it. It was the first and only book to show how much U.S. intelligence has been privatized. And one of my big findings back then was that 70% of the U.S. budget for intelligence goes to private contractors. And that, right, 10 years later, I think that I've learned recently that that's close. That figure now has gone down to maybe about 60%, but 30% of the intelligence workforce is contractors. So, 1/3 of the workforce and almost 2/3 of the budget is for the private sector. So, and I've had articles in the Nation. One I did about a year ago showing that over the last five years or so, that because of the consolidation of the contracting industry, there are now 5 corporations that pretty much dominate the intelligence contracting industry. 5 companies.
Wow.
So in this industry, we now have a monopoly, and I think it's high time that we really looked at the implications of this, because I think privatized intelligence, it means there's a lot of loopholes, and it's a lot easier to evade congressional oversight. And plus, there's just huge amounts of waste and huge amounts of corruption within the spending that these companies drink up. I mean, the amount of money floating through the Washington, D.C. area to intelligence contracting is a story in itself. It's enormous. And just the other day, a friend of mine and I went up to the National Security Agency, drove past, and there's this right by the National Security Agency. There is a business park where all the contractors that do business with the NSA have their headquarters where their NSA work. And it's an enormous park. There's these enormous buildings, and you really get this, you see all the logos there: Lockheed Martin, Booz Allen Hamilton, Raytheon, IBM, a lot of companies people have never heard of. But that's, where the intelligence work is done. And you have to almost see it to believe it.
That's incredible. And you wrote that before kind of the Edward Snowden kind of helped expose the fact that was all going on.
I wrote this long before Edward Snowden was ever on the scene. And, basically, I wrote about it after, sort of in the aftermath of, when we learned about the from the New York Times about the vast, this domestic surveillance that the NSA started doing, how they turned all their foreign intelligence, technical apparatus, they just turned that on the American people domestically and began to monitor U.S. domestic traffic without warrants. And so I wrote in the aftermath of that, I wanted to show, that a lot of that was being done by U.S. corporations, a lot of that surveillance work, and it still is. Ironically, Edward Snowden was a contractor. He worked for Booz Allen, and he somehow talked his way into the position of Booz because he knew that he knew, and he said this publicly, that he would be able to get the secrets out of there easier as working for Booz than working directly for the NSA. So I think, I've written about this in the Washington Post. There's some real big holes in the sort of institutional security with contractors, and a lot of a lot of leaks are in my view justified as whistleblowing, but there's a lot of leaks that are not. And I think contractors certainly do not get the scrutiny they should be in terms of how they handle U.S. national secrets.
Does Congress have the same, obviously Congress has the intelligence committees that they can haul the CIA in there if they need to. Do they have the same access to these contractors, or is that just totally opaque to them?
It's pretty opaque. I mean, it's shockingly, to me, there's been very little congressional investigation of the role of contractors, exactly what they do, and to their extent, the extent of their operations and influence. Every time there's a scandal, like, for example, after Snowden unmasked himself as a contractor, days after, leaking those documents, I wrote an article in the New York Times about, contractors and how deep it went, and quoting, various senators like Senator Feinstein from California at that time, the chairwoman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and she's going, "Oh yeah, we have to look at these contractors, and that this is like really a serious issue." And they never did. And so like in intelligence as well as just regular military contracting, what you have is a lot of large contractors that sign what they call prime contracts, big, large, multi-$100 million contracts, and then they subcontract to all kinds of smaller companies, not only smaller, bigger and smaller companies. They subcontract, certain tasks of those contracts to other companies. And so it's the primes that have the primary responsibility for sort of oversight of their contractors. The government, of course, has to know how much the subcontractors are charging, and they see some figures, but they don't reach down into the prime contractors and find out what the subcontractors do. And that's a huge hole in the oversight process, in my opinion. And that's where Congress should play a role. One time, about 5 years ago, the committee in the Senate, the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Government Operations, had the first hearing on contractors, and they called me up and asked me to come in and give them some advice on what they might try to look at in the hearings. And what I told them was, I think the American people deserve to meet the CEOs of these companies that are, helping to run our intelligence service. Bring in the CEOs of Booz Allen Hamilton, Mantech, Khaki, and have them, have them answer questions about what they do and the extent of the work they have for the various agencies, from NSA to CIA, to National Geospatial Intelligence, all the agencies. Of course, they took this advice, but of course they didn't do it. They had a kind of desultory hearing where, it wasn't, not much was divulged, and it was just sort of, there wasn't much deep analysis of their role at all. And of course, no CEOs were called at all. So, I think there's a kind of avoidance of this whole issue. And part of it, the reason is that, there's a powerful constituency. You certainly, when you hear, people in Congress talk about NSA and, oversteps by the NSA and other agents, or the CIA, you don't hear that much from the senators from Maryland or the senators from Virginia, because, this is where there's so many of these contractors, and they provide lawmakers with, lots of money and make large political donations. And so these lawmakers, they actually, I've talked to people that used to work in intelligence who tell me that, contractors come over there with their lawmakers sometime. Hey, we want more work. We want more of this government work to be made available to contractors, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of lobbying that goes on and a lot of support, for the contractors from lawmakers. So I think that's one of the inhibitions that Congress has.
Yeah, I mean, money and secrecy and all this stuff together is not a good mix. Well, great. I thought this was really, really good talking to you. We learned a lot of interesting things about the current crisis in Korea and the Sony hack, and even a lot about intelligence outsourcing. So, thanks very much for talking. Is there anything you want to add, or let people know where they can find your articles?
The best place is to search me, Tim Shorrock, SHORROCK, at The Nation. I have a page at The Nation. And you can, it's just all my articles there going way, way back, or just come right after the other. And my website, timshorrock.com, I've got a lot of stuff there about intelligence and a lot of documents I've obtained over the years, and a lot of journalism going way back as well. The last thing I'd want to say is that in terms of Korea, it's really important to pay attention to South Korea, because there's very little known, about the dynamics of South Korean society, and especially its political scene here in the United States, and people don't pay much attention to it. But South Korea is a very dynamic place, and there's a very strong left, very, very strong, progressive tradition there, and very strong unions, civic organizations, peace organizations. And there's a lot of resistance to this, militarism. There's a resistance to the U.S. THAAD missile deployment. There's a lot of concern about what Trump may do. And like I said, it was the people's candlelight revolution that brought on this impeachment of the last president and helped elect the President Moon. And so, that's something that people here in America should both, respect and pay attention to.
Cool. Well, I hope they will, and we'll definitely all be watching this story play out and these tensions work their way through the political system. So thanks a lot again, Tim. I appreciate you talking to me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
This is Our Hidden History